Buonasera. Buonasera.
Good evening to all of you. You have been following us from all over the world. I'd like to thank you very much for having been so loyal to our program. I have to say that the figures have been extraordinary. We've had 6,000, let's say, visualization every evening. That for a scientific meeting is really quite amazing. So this evening we are practically at our final one of this first series of human brains, consciousness and culture and consciousness. So we have wanted to call them discussions that have as a central topic consciousness, and as a consciousness is expressed in human brains, and I'm talking about brains in the plural sense because there's no brain which is equal to the other. So we started off from the microstructures, the clusters of just a few neurons, to get to the complexity of the human brain project, which aims at replicating the entire brain but in a digital form. So we have heard from some of the most authoritative neuroscientists in the international field talk about language, art, the arts, creativity, and of the relationship between the most sophisticated forms of human expression with the emergence of consciousness. The possibility of having the consciousness of a body which is not your own through the embodiment. That is how you can practically immerse yourself in a virtual body and feel the emotions of an ego which is different from that of ourselves. And then the role of epigenetics, that is the regulation of genes which would have determined the great evolutionary differences between us, descendants of Homo sapiens, and other animals which on a genetic level are extremely similar to us. Now, in this last minute, we are proposing something different. That is a comparison between neuroscience and philosophy on the topic of consciousness. Philosophy, from the beginning of its manifestation in the Greek world, reflects on consciousness, on our ability to think the thought, and practically, extremizing incompatibility or trying to integrate the concept of body with that of the soul. Now, neuroscientists, as they were trying to determine what consciousness is, must obviously also consider the philosopher's thoughts, even by those who have a reductionistic vision of thought and of decision-making, which would be a mandatory outcome of the genetic, biological, cultural, and environmental factors. Now, the Prada Foundation that has promoted this interdisciplinary reflection in line with the perspective of a new, integrated, holistic culture in which science and humanities practically converge and stimulate one another, creating the idea of the Leonardo-like man, as has been mentioned by some of our speakers, could not fail to conclude the first cycle of human brains with an exchange between a philosopher and a neuroscientist. So we have here virtually with us from Wisconsin, where he lives and teaches. Oh, there he is. I couldn't see him. Hello, Giulio. Good evening. Good evening. So we have with us Giulio Tononi. He teaches psychiatry and directs the Center for Sleep and Consciousness at the University of Wisconsin. Giulio Tononi is one of the greatest world's experts in the field of research on consciousness. And then we have Michele Di Francesco also with us. Here he is. He is the president of the Italian Society of Neuroethics, and he teaches logic and philosophy of science at the Superior University School of Pavia. Now, the meeting will be held in English and in Italian, and allow me to say that I'm personally very, very proud of the contribution of our scholars to science and to the culture of the world. Now, before leaving the floor to Professor Di Francesco, I'd like to remind you that it is possible to send questions on our website. Obviously, we won't be able maybe to answer them all, but we will try to select the most important one. Now, I'd like to leave the screen to Michele Di Francesco. As we said, he is a full professor of logic and philosophy at the University Superior School of Pavia, USO, of which he has been rector, dean from 2013 to 2019. He is currently president of the Italian Society of Neuroethics, and he has been president of the European Society and also of the Italian Society of Analytical Philosophy, and also member of the Jean Nicot Institute in Paris. with Massimo Cacciari, Edoardo Boncinelli, Andrea Moro, and Roberto Mordaci. Both Massimo Cacciari and Andrea Moro are part of our scientific committee. He has been on the committee of the Faculty of Philosophy of the San Raffaele University, of which he has been a dean from 2007 to 2013. Now, Professor Di Francesco is part of that small community of philosophers that has contributed in introducing analytical philosophy in Italy, with specific reference to the philosophy of the mind and cognitive sciences. More specific themes of his research are subjectivity and the foundations of personal identity. And there are two books that describe the evolution of his thought on the subject: The Ego and the Selves Itself, Personal Identity and the Science of the Mind, published by Cortina in 1998, and that has been recently reprinted. And then The Self and Its Defenses, From Psychodynamics to Cognitive Science, that has been published by Palgrave Macmillan in London in 2016, and written with a contribution of Massimo Marraffa and Alfredo Paternoster. Another, let's say, object of his studies is that of the model of the extended mind and the relationship between cognition and technologies of the mind. I asked him, how did this love for philosophy start? And he answered that it started off from his personality that was very, very reflective. So I can imagine a kid that was always there reading instead of going around and playing with a ball and with a tennis racket. But then it bloomed, let's say, blossomed from when he met Bertrand Russell, his encounter, with Bertrand Russell during high school, and his passion for science fiction as his inspiration, starting off from that dystopian metaphysics of Philip Dick, a passion that I personally share. Philip Dick is one of my legends, but unfortunately I stopped there. So now I leave it to you, because you are the expert and you carried on these studies, and certainly today you will be explaining to us what philosophy can tell us about consciousness. So thank you so much for this very kind words of introduction. I'd like to thank the Fondazione Prada for this event. I really think it is a remarkable event, very unusual, but also something that can really help us, because we can see that we can still work together, we can still pursue our path of knowledge even at difficult times, such as the ones we're going through now. So it's an honor to participate, a great opportunity and an honor for me to participate. As far as I'm concerned, what I have tried to do is to initially provide you with a state-of-the-art of philosophical reflection concerning the topic of consciousness, with an approach that is both theoretical and historical. So basically, I studied the past 50 years, which are a lot for 30 minutes, but obviously I wanted to be concise, so I took the last 50 years of discussion to see how they accompanied the study of the mind before, with the cognitive science, the neurosciences. So I hope this will be useful then for our discussion, and obviously for an interactive discussion on the relationship between philosophy and science, that I see having a great potential in terms of the collaboration that may exist between the two. So to start off, I'd like to start off from a quote. This quote may appear pessimistic in a way, but in reality, it is, I believe, a good starting point for my presentation. How is it that something so remarkable as the state of consciousness comes about as a result of a stimulation of the nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of Jean when Aladdin rubbed his lamp? And this comes from Thomas Huxley. He was a biologist. He also wrote philosophical books. He was a Darwinian, convinced Darwinian expert, and this can, to some extent, I think, reflect the disconcertment, the bafflement of one who studied neurosciences for the relationship between consciousness and its physical basis. Certainly, enormous progress has been made since then, from the 19th century, especially in the field of neurosciences. Huge steps forward have been made, so one could think, okay, this bafflement is over. But from a philosophical standpoint, the seeds of the challenge, that was a conceptual challenge, is, I think, still very much present in contemporary debate. And amongst other things, this has been indirectly proven also by the fact that many contemporary authors, Ned Block amongst the many, have mentioned this in their works of the 90s of the past century. So at 130 years, after 130 years, this problem came up again. So the objective is to describe the surprising state of affairs. And after having devoted a prologue to the description of a very crucial point of our history, of our modern philosophical history, that is the Cartesian identification between mind and consciousness, obviously that starts the modern way of seeing the mind. I will be examining three phases of philosophical reflection that are connected to three reflections of how we can offer a theory of consciousness that may explain its place in the natural world. So one concerns the development of classic cognitive science from the 50s to the 70s up to the 90s. This is characterized by a computational vision of the mind, and by computational vision, what I mean is that even if the metaphor has been considered misleading, to see the mind as a software, the thought as a processing of information, on the one hand, and on the other ones, the downsizing of the centrality of consciousness vis-a-vis the cognitive and mental phenomena. Just to mention an author, if you follow these themes, is Jerry Fodor. And then the second phase, which is connected to the birth around the 90s of the past century of scientific theories of consciousness. And obviously, we had these before as well, but a moment has come. By the way, a lot of the people that are participating in these series of sessions have provided interesting contributions, I would say, to this blossoming of theories of consciousness, including my other colleague, Professor Tononi, who will be speaking later. But I'm thinking also about Jean-Pierre Changeau, for instance, rather than Antonio Damasio. And finally, this phase is linked from a philosophical standpoint to the return of the centrality of the subjective states of experience, the ones that have been then called qualia. And here we could mention David Chalmers. And then the phase linked to the return of the centrality of the phenomenology dimension as a starting point for the study of mental phenomena. And this is, let's say, with a pinch of salt, we could call it going back to Descartes, that characterizes a part of the contemporary philosophy. If we're afraid of talking about Descartes, we can say a return to phenomenology in the sense of, obviously, all the various subsequent doctrines. And a couple of words on Descartes. In 1641, in his Metaphysical Meditations, he proposes an investigation on the nature of thought, of the self, and practically he says, he answers the question, who am I? I am something that thinks. And something that thinks, what is something that thinks? It's a thing that questions, that intends, that affirms, that denies, that wants, that does not want, that even imagines and that feels. So today could seem to us a rather obvious definition, but it was revolutionary at the time, because if you know about the philosophical thoughts of the time, the theories of the 17th century, I'm sure that you realize that Descartes here puts within a single classification, and he says intends, doubts, affirms, denies, wants, does not want, feels. So he's putting together properties which are for scholastic Aristotelian philosophy of the times he lived at, they were kept distinct. Obviously, it was connected to Aristotle that saw three basic souls. One was the vegetative one, the one was a sensitive one, the other one was a rational one, where what characterized the human being was the rational one. Here instead, Descartes does two operations. He puts together the sensitivity and reason and introduces a different type of sensitivity, because when he imagines a mind that can be separate from the body, that feels, he is separating feelings, bodiness, and has a notion of feeling which is like mere or pure thinking. A contemporary expert is the film Matrix, if I can be irreverent, where the protagonists enter, let's say, the cybernetic virtual space as though they were softwares, and they operate in a way which is immaterial in that type of reality. But this is an intangibility which is not that of the soul, but that of abstract models such as the ones of software. Anyways, there is also a comment by Rorty, who says that once that Descartes invented that precise sense of feeling as nothing else but thinking, we start losing contact with the Aristotelian distinction between reason and the body and the sensation and the feelings. And this new mind-body distinction, according to Rorty, leads to a distinction between two worlds more than between two sides of the human being. So this is an accusation of dualism for Descartes. I find that some of the distinctions by Descartes are very interesting. And by this, what I'd like to say, it's not really necessary to get to dualist outcomes starting off from his position. And then his position, and this maybe will be, let's say, a further or a step that can also be considered quite surprising, coming from Descartes, which is still in his metaphysical meditations, where he says, okay, now there is nothing that nature teaches me more explicitly and clearly than the fact that I have a body. By means of these feelings, sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, nature is also teaching me that I am not present to my body as a helmsman is present to the ship, but that I am so connected to it, I'm so merged with it, that I constitute with it one whole. And it is true that such feelings of hunger, thirst are nothing else but confused ways of thinking that come and depend on the union, and so to speak, the mixing, the merging of the mind with the body. As you can see, also an attention to this new vision of the mind, which is very important, that corresponds, that identifies the mind with consciousness, where you have both the feeling and the reasoning. Well, this Cartesian identification between mind and consciousness can also be compatible with obviously the organization of thought.
Once said so, as a prologue, I'd like to start with the first point, the issue between consciousness and classical cognitive science. Descartes, we said, introduces the notion of the mind, which coincides with consciousness, and this is accepted by Locke and other scholars later on. But between the 18th and the 19th century, it is known that the centrality of consciousness in general loses importance at cultural level. On the scientific plane, we could talk about Watson and behaviorism, James and consciousness as a process and not as a substance, or Freud and the unconscious, or Wittgenstein, who criticizes the Cartesian private, and then think about literature, arts, which tended to develop the awareness of how many shadows we have in human thought, and to which extent we don't understand self-deceivement in the life of people. So there is a reviewing of consciousness. The crucial step, though, from our point of view, because we're interested in the scientific study of consciousness and its contribution to the understanding of this phenomenon is the advent of cognitivism. Cognitivism is a research program that developed starting in the 50s of last century after behaviorism, and sees the participation of different disciplines which we have seen during these meetings this week, having a dialogue with neurosciences, i.e. psychology, artificial intelligence, linguistics, philosophy, neuroscience, obviously, and anthropology, all things that we have already seen represented in cognitivism, in contemporary cognitivism. These were connected with the unitary vision of the mind. The mind was not seen as a collection of contents of consciousness, but as a set of psychobiological functions that present themselves to our attention in the ways of self-conscious subjectivity. There are functions, psychobiological functions, that we do not observe directly, but we observe their product. At cognitive level, they can be described as computations on representations. In other words, a software. And this software processes representations of the external world of ourselves. What is a representation? Well, basically, when I ask myself, is the cathedral in Milan, can you have access to it through one single door, or are there many doors? What I'm trying is to represent the cathedral in Milan thanks to my memory, and I try and give an answer to this question. And when I try to understand the quickest way between A and B, also in this case, I have a mental map of what happens. And representations are the way in which we represent the external world to ourselves. We can also represent aspects of my nature. And so here we intend the external worlds in general. And these representations are manipulated via computations, which are implemented by our brain, so seen as brain hardware. And note that the psychic activities that operate in this case are not necessarily consciousness, but they operate at a level which has been called subpersonal, and subpersonal means unconscious, but without what Freud meant by it. And they're not accessible to the consciousness of the subject, but rather essential for the good functioning of the brain and of our capability of acting. These are states in which we build those contents which sometimes have access to our consciousness, depending on the different theories of consciousness circulating today. And computations and representations almost never appear in Descartes. And again, on this point, imagine I'm trying to remember. I see an actor at the cinema, and I can't think of his name. I have it on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember the name. Now, this very simple phenomenon is connected with the idea that we are somehow not capable of activating consciously the computations that would allow us to go and get that piece of information in our memory. Either this comes natural, but this natural is at the level of consciousness, but at the unconscious level, there are cognitive actions that take place without our control. So these actions almost never appear in the consciousness we have. And maybe the idea is a bit too simplistic, but the idea that mental phenomena, our software, can already give us an idea of this, and also give us the possibility of looking at how we can start extracting the nature of what conscious phenomena are. This is a last quote by Hilary Putnam, and it dates back to the 60s, and then it was reprinted. And it's a way of explaining and describing pain as a functional state. Pain is not a brain state in the sense of a physical, chemical state of the brain. but a completely different kind of state. I propose the hypothesis that pain, or the state of feeling pain, is a functional state of the whole organism, says Putnam. Well, from this point of view, this proposal can be the basis of a form of physicalism. This is a contemporary term for materialism. Physicalism that does not want to represent the mind as purely material, but it reduces it to a sort of set of mental states which take place in the brain but get identified at a different level, which is the functional one in the description of functions. As when I want to describe the engine of a car, as that part that allows, the car to move. I apologize to those who know more about engines, but the concept basically is a higher level of abstraction where we describe conscious states as functional states of the brain. The study of the mind allows us to explain, or to hope we can build scientific and naturalistic models in line with natural sciences of how we can represent the world, and therefore to explain the intentionality of our mind. But now what emerged is that explaining intentionality in terms of functional states, in terms of processing of information, is one thing. And explaining consciousness is something different, is something else. And cognitivism, the main authors of cognitivism understand quite quickly this. And this is Jerry Fodor's quote. We're in 1977, and it's during the 70s that these reflections came out. Based on the current situation, wrote Fodor, the realm of the mind seems to forge into propositional states with a certain content, those that allow us to describe the world through representations, and qualitative states, feelings, subjectivity. We'll go back to this. We have some ideas about how the former, the proportional states and the representations of the worlds could be transformed into the objects of a science compatible with the demands of materialism. But in the case of the latter, qualitative states, both epistemological and ontological problems remain unknown. We seem to be at the threshold of a psychology of propositional attitudes, and the psychology of consciousness continues to elude us. Now, this is the point I wanted to get to. It's what allows me to say that, look, cognitivism and cognitive science tried in all possible ways to provide a representational analysis and a computational analysis of mental phenomena, and leaving to the future, to an indeterminate future, the solution of the problem of consciousness. And why does this happen? Well, this happens because the problem of consciousness talks about the subjective experience of subjects and the nature of such experience. And this is something that has been noticed by Thomas Nagel, for example, in an article he wrote in 1974, whose title was What It Is Like to Be a Bat. And Nagel writes, the fact that an organism has somehow conscious experience means fundamentally that it makes it's strange to be that organism. We can call this a subjective character of experience. It is not captured by any of the familiar analyses of the mental recently elaborated, because they're all logically compatible with its absence. It cannot be analyzed in terms of some explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, because these could be attributed to robo or automatons that behave like people, even if they do not have experience of anything. What Nagel is telling us is that we are missing a signature. We are missing the accurate identification of what consciousness, of what makes consciousness what it is. I mean, we cannot explain the relationship between our physical nature and consciousness, because we can imagine creatures with the same functional states we have, but without consciousness. They could be robots, they could be automatons that can mime human behavior, but are not conscious. And in fact, in these meetings, we've also had discussions about artificial intelligence, and this is one of the theses that is currently being discussed with, is it possible to have a hard artificial intelligence that really creates thinking machines? And we will talk about this during the debate, maybe. To conclude with this, we notice that we have now introduced two distinctions. You know that making distinctions is very important in philosophical work. A personal distinction or subpersonal distinction which recognizes the existence of unconscious subpersonal mental states made by classical cognitive science, and a distinction between intentionality, i.e. Mental representations, and consciousness, where the first notion was presented as naturalizable, so to speak, that could be studied through natural sciences, whilst the second one still appeared as metaphysically elusive from the point of view of the substantial nature. And this, again, is Nagel, again, about his book on the bat. At the moment, the state of physicalism is similar to the hypothesis that matter is energy would have had if it had been supported by a pre-Socratic philosopher. We don't have any idea of how this could be true. And in this manner, we know that cognitive science, which has given a lot to introduce the study of the mind, has not really studied consciousness. There have also been Barsh, Charles, etc., but it's been partly reticent. This reluctance shouldn't last too long, and in fact it didn't happen. There have been very many reasons why philosophers have started dealing with consciousness again with more enthusiasm. But the main one, certainly from the point of view of our conversations on the relationships between culture and consciousness, are the development of scientific research, which has been extraordinary thanks to neurotechnologies that would make a series of consciousness theories possible based on neurobiology and cognition. And I repeat once again, we've met some authors of these theories, and today I think we will have the pleasure of listening to something very interesting with Professor Giulio Tononi. And the question they often ask themselves during the 90s, very many philosophers asked themselves, was, are the theories of consciousness explaining the subjectivity of it? All those aspects we've taken from Nagel's thinking, which have also been proposed by others, lead us to the second part of our discussion, i.e. phenomenal consciousness and the so-called hard problem of consciousness.
Now, to get there, another distinction could be useful, which is the one, here I chose the phenomenal and the access consciousness. We could have spoken about the psychological one, as David Chalmers says, the cognitive one, or ourness as opposed to consciousness. But the distinction is this. The phenomenal one is the experience in first person of having certain quality experiences of what happens to us when people have certain feelings, a state of mind, emotions, feelings as they are called. They correspond to a series of mental phenomena which make up the experience, which is experienced of the living agents that we are. The axis consciousness, instead, is a construction of the sciences of the mind, practically, which is identified by the mind. As we said, it is characterized functionally as the ability by a system, for instance, this is Bloch's definition of having access to one's interior states for the purposes of verbalization, organization of action, and also construction of models of oneself which can be used in social interaction. So this aspects of this consciousness have been presented during this week of reflections and studies. So many of the authors who have then contributed in orienting the philosophical debate on consciousness, so we have Ned Bloch, Frank Jackson, Colin McGinn, John Searle, David Chalmers, have raised some metaphysical and conceptual question, let's say, subscribing to the thesis that what it feels to be ourselves cannot be excluded from the rules of the world, but it can't even be, let's say, seized concretely with the refined elaborations or processing, or let's say, of the scientific processing of the mind, because they do not provide an answer, let's say, to the problem of the relationship between brain activity and genesis of the phenomenological world of the first-person subjective experience. Now, going back to what we said before, it's the phenomenal consciousness that appears to, or seemed at the time, to elude the explicative abilities by the scientific theories of consciousness. So obviously this has not been mentioned by all philosophers. In fact, some developed models of consciousness that wanted to be more naturalistic, whilst others instead believed instead that it was premature simply, but that there were in fact hopes of obtaining, let's say, explanations in the future. I called this period, the state of the art in the philosophical debate, the Quaglia War, the War of Quaglia. So this was a period that cover a rather long period of time, and we still are discussing about it now. In fact, in philosophy, it's still being discussed. But we can say that in the 90s and then in the first years of the 21st century, the debate was still very, very active. Let's say, was quite strong. And what surfaced were certain trends, let's say, certain lines of thought. I'd like to mention one in particular, which is the limit set by the fact that a functional analysis, so to explain the functions of something, very often what is enough is to explain the nature of something. For instance, from a biological point of view, if I say that the heart is a pump, that it behaves in a certain way, what am I doing? I am at least partially able to explain what the heart is, what it does, what its function is. And I can easily introduce it in a scientific description of the human body. It becomes part of a scientific description of the human body. When you said, I asked myself, what is the nature of consciousness? Describing it is very complex because of its subjectivity. And then to explain how this entity or how these phenomena that I have access to in an intrinsically subjective way, how they can be connected to objective phenomena which are in my brain, this may create a problem. And this problem has been called the explanatory gap. This, let's say, that this void, this vacuum that existed, that practically has prevented the solution of the so-called hard problem, what's been defined as the hard problem, whilst other aspects of the functioning of our minds that instead concern consciousness were connected in the so-called easy problems. Now, allow me to say that the problems of the consciousness are all but easy, so they're all difficult practically. So I think that the distinction was not a very correct one. But anyways, this is how they've been then defined as. A person who was a person who devoted a lot of attention to these subjects, summarized in 3 lines the nature of the problem. It's a bit technical in the terminology, but I'd like to just repeat it. The phenomena to be reduced, such as, for instance, the conscious phenomenon or consciousness. So these phenomena are conceptualized in, let's say, relational or extrinsic ways in terms of their causal relations with other phenomena, and not intrinsically in terms of their internal qualitative character or structural composition. It's as though we were saying the scientific explanation in the terms of the causes for something does not succeed in entering the intrinsic dimension of the qualitative phenomena. So I can imagine, for instance, an entity, a being that has exactly my same type of brain organization with all of the causal relationship existed amongst the various neurons, for instance, rather than sets of synapses and neurons together. So, and you can simulate this aspect, absolutely, but from this I cannot draw the nomological need, so on the basis of the rules of nature, that this entity may have a phenomenal type of thought, because, all right, for instance, I can imagine that a person has exactly, let's say, the same brain organization as my brain, but when we look at a ripe tomato, maybe he has an experience of seeing something that's green and I have the experience of seeing something that's red, and we will never, it's a bit shaky, sorry, this comparison, but anyways, if there were a complete symmetry in the organization of the perception of the colors, we would never be able to really understand the difference, because every time that he says red, he means what I mean by green, and vice versa. And in the practical behavior, because we have been trained to use the term, for instance, at the traffic light, I stop when I see red, he stops when he sees the green light. And so the experiences are different, but the light signals, let's say, are the same. And so there is no possibility of actually identifying or detecting the difference. So how did the debate proceed? Well, in general, with mind experiments. I'd like to indicate one very briefly. This is Mary's thought experiment, the knowledge argument as it is known. So this is the way the experiment works. Let's imagine that we have a young student or a young graduate, a neuroscientist, living in a room where everything is black and white. So there are no visible colors. All objects are either white or black, and she studies on books that have no color pictures. She receives information from monitors that are all black and white. But with great determination, this person studies neuroscience and learns all that she needs to know from a neurobiological standpoint for on the perception of colors. So at this point, our Mary is practically omniscient as far as the neurobiological theories are concerned of the knowledge of colors. So Mary finally is freed from her room. She can go out, and when she leaves the room, she sees for the first time a flower. And it is the only image that I wanted to, put for my presentation. So this is a flower. You see that with red petals. And so the question that Frank Jackson is asking us, but does Mary learn something new when she actually sees a red flower or a red tomato for the first time? Does she say, oh, finally I understood what it means to be seeing something in red? According to Jackson, the answer answer is yes. And this positive answer means that because Mary already knew about all of the physical facts, the subjective experience of the red refers to facts that are not physical facts. And this could be an example of a possible theory of mental experiments. This book, There's Something About Mary, then other books have been published. You know that the debate is very complex, and so it's not as simple as I have now obviously told you the story, but this was just to give you an idea of how these theories have been presented. And this is the way in which practically the discussion has actually proceeded on the existence of qualia. How did it end up? Well, no shared solutions have been found. There have been like two opposing parties that emerged. One that believes that the phenomenal experience does not really affect materialism or physicalism because it can be explained either scientifically with representational theories of consciousness or because the qualia in reality do not exist. They are a philosophical illusion. And this is a theory that Daniel Dennett, let's say, maintains, or others who believe that the qualia do exist, but they're not just reducible to the physical. And the latter adhere or subscribe to the dualism of properties. So there are entities such as our brain that have the capability of producing, let's say, both physical and phenomena, as well as phenomena which are not reducible to the physical. Or you have emergentism, and you have other. You see, I see that time is running short, so I have to sort of hurry up. Now, the result that we obtain here is what I already mentioned before, and what Kim called physicalism, or something that's quite similar to physicalism. That is, we accept the idea that we're not able to explain qualitative states, but we explain all the rest. Well, we have explained a very important part of reality. Even if we cannot imagine that qualia cannot be reduced to physical states, we must nevertheless be very cautious in thinking that qualia have causal properties, and so that they interact with the physical part, because if they were to interact with the physical part, we would have a violation of these causal principles of physics, so the idea that the physical world is closed. Think about the conservation laws of energy, so principles which are very, very strong, and it's difficult to give them up. So some people say, okay, you can't propose a philosophical theory that destroys these principles altogether. You need to admit that qualia exist, but they don't have a causal efficacy in our world. So in reality, they probably would be like the last residue of Cartesian consciousness that we cannot explain in a materialistic manner, but that it's very limited if you think about the entire world. So this is obviously not the entire conclusion, but it is a conclusion that could come near to what we are saying, unless you think that the heart problem has a more draconian solution and that it can lead to the idea of a purely mental causality apart from the physical one, aside from the physical one. We are at last point, and I will be quite short on this. I'd simply like to mention an element which is quite important. I mentioned this even because I hope it may be useful in the interaction with Professor Tononi, because some of the themes of this last part are then found again in some of, let's say, the most speculative part. And said by a philosopher, this is I'm complimenting his work in a way.
And this is a quote of Uriah Kriegel. The philosophers of the mind have recently, and this is a book dating back to 2013, the last 20 years, have recently tried to find new and creative approaches to the mind-body problem that would escape the forced choice between materialism and dualism. The hope is to find a position that gives rise neither to an explanatory gap between mind and matter, as materialism does, nor to the causal inertia of the mind with respect to matter, as dualism does. The doubt we referred to before. And how was this done? Well, by introducing two factors to, let's say, fields of research. The first is the development of a cognitive phenomenology and the program of phenomenal intentionality. These are complex terms, but what I mean to say with this is phenomenal intentionality means going back to the roots of classic phenomenology by Brentano and Russell, where consciousness and intentionality used to go together. And intentionality is the capability of representing the world. I'd like to remind you this representational capability linked to conscious thinking. Our conscious thoughts have conditions which can be satisfied, and if satisfied, they represent something. If I have a mental image, I have a representation of the Cathedral of Milan in my mind, and the Cathedral of Milan has specific features which are similar to those I am representing into my mind, my mental representation at that point has a real content, and so I can explain my capability of referring to Milan's cathedral because the phenomenological content and the other one coexist. So cognitive phenomenology is a thesis that widens the field of consciousness. It does not reduce it to sensory states or bodily experiential states such as pain or understanding a hue of red or seeing a hue of red, but also applies this to other fields such as beliefs, desires, etc. And the second is the development of ontologies, of models of realities in which phenomenal consciousness plays a central role, such as Russell's monism and panpsychism. Panpsychism, and here we go to our last before last, that states that the fundamental entity, point two, the intrinsic nature of basic physical entities has to do with phenomenal consciousness. The idea is that at their intrinsic nature, physical entities such as electrons or quarks are micro subjects of phenomenal consciousness, and being an electron or a quark, for example, makes the entity feel something. This seemed to me a not plausible theory, but it's been defended, so to speak, with growing rigor. And let's say that it led to a lot of discussions ranging from the philosophy of physics to the philosophy of the mind, which should be taken into serious account, I believe. So by way of summary, for classical cognitive science, the mind began with subpersonal processes from which consciousness emerged. For the new trends, the starting point to study the mind is the phenomenological approach with a more internist and Descartes' vision, Cartesian vision, which approaches the phenomenological tradition of Brentano and Russell. We are therefore in the presence of a program which gives centrality to the experience lived in the first person, but which does not exclude and in fact can be supportive in the following construction of models of how the brain works, of scientific models of the way in which the mind works. I apologize because I was a bit too fast during the last part of my presentation, but I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I've concluded. I'd like to thank you, Michele, because you explained in a very simple manner concepts which are extremely complicated. I understood myself, so I'm really glad, and I think that all those who followed us have been struck by your explanation, which in the end is something that starts what Mr. Tononi will talk about, because Mr. Tononi is a scholar who studies consciousness, and so maybe he'll answer some of the questions you've raised. And now I'd like to say that it probably take half an hour to properly introduce Giulio Tononi, one of the internationally renowned giants of consciousness studies. He's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist who lives and teaches in the United States but comes from Italy. He teaches at the University of Wisconsin. I'd like to imagine you into red woods, if they're still red, in that wonderful American nature we, unfortunately, in Europe cannot see. But basically, Mr. Tononi teaches psychiatry, and he directs the Center for Sleep and Consciousness at the University of Wisconsin, after graduating at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, which is one of the flagships of our academy. Mr. Tononi is one of the world's leading recognized authorities in the study of the function of sleep and of the nature of consciousness, and has developed a theory, the Integrated Information Theory, IIT, which aims to quantify its mathematical scope by means of a quantity indicated by the letter phi, the Greek letter phi. Phi, A Journey from the Brain to the Soul, is also the title of an original essay, novel, I wouldn't know how to describe it, published by Codice in 2014. And it's a sort of secular Divina Commedia in which the protagonist is Galileo Galilei, led in his peregrination in the discovery of consciousness, not by Virgil, Beatrice, or St. Bernard, but by Francis Crick, Alan Turing, and Charles Darwin. I could go on for a long time about Tononi's work and international recognitions, but he warned me not to do this. And so I give him the floor, because Mr. Tononi will explain to us what consciousness is from his point of view, and what the place of consciousness is in nature, i.e., can conscious be dissociated from behavior? Is it being or doing? Is consciousness determined by the feelings, sensations coming from the outside, or does it derive from them? To you. Thank you very much, Viviana, and thanks to Michele for the elegant and wide introduction of the philosophical reading of consciousness. I should be able to use the slides, but nothing is happening. I can't go forward with my slides. Now, you heard a lot about consciousness. I'll start in Italian, then I'll move on to English. But I'd like to give you a very clear explanation so that we all mean the same thing. Consciousness is what goes away when one falls into dreamless sleep.
Nothing better than a slide from Michelangelo, La Notte, and his own sonnet, Caro me il sonno e più l'esser di sasso, mentre che il danno e la vergogna dura, non vedere.
Dream and sleep is very important for me.
Very well, what we all know, that when we fall into dreamless sleep, everything vanishes. Nothing is left. Not myself, not my room, not my body, not my country, not anything whatsoever. No sounds, no sights, no shapes, no colors, no thoughts, no feelings. Everything is gone. And that is what the absence of consciousness is. It's literally the absence of existence. And then when you wake up in the morning, everything suddenly reappears. Sounds and sights and colors and thoughts. That is what consciousness is. It is, I like to say, everything we are and everything we have. Take consciousness away, they can promise you the entire world. But if you're not there with your consciousness, there is literally nothing at all. But that's a very good first point to say that consciousness is everything. The second is, going back to Thomas Nagel, mentioned by Michele, another good way of putting what consciousness is to be conscious is to have an experience, what it is like to be, which I'm going to use here this image. Imagine waking up after dozing off with a book in your hand, with your body, your bed, your room, and the world outside. Okay? You have an experience. There is something it is like to be you in that moment. And every experience is what consciousness is, including an experience of a purely dark, vast screen or the sky at night. It's an experience too. There are no objects in it. You may have no thoughts whatsoever. That's often what happens when you wake up in the morning. Sometimes there is nothing for the moment, except for just darkness and silence. But that's an experience too. There is something it is like to be there. It is a sense of presence or consciousness. Now, I want to say a few things about what is not consciousness, because often this is a source of misunderstandings. consciousness is not just self-reflection. As indicated here, yes, many philosophers actually had sort of fallen into the trap of considering that, which is the typical philosophical thing to do, you're sitting on your chair and then thinking about consciousness, and it seems like the only experience there is when you're thinking about it. But that's not true. You are conscious whether you think about it or not, whether you tell yourself you're conscious or not. Just take this image, for instance. You are faced with an immense onslaught of experience, and you just have it before you tell yourself what it is. The same is true for an action movie when you're skiing very fast down the hill. There is just experience before you can even reflect on that. So self-reflection is a part of experience, but it doesn't exhaust it. Another thing, which now refers to what Michele mentioned as intentionality representation, is very often people focus on experience of the outside world, the world out there, whether it's the expo and the crowd around it or anything else. Yes, that is experience, but that's not the only kind of experience we have. And I'm using here this painting by Boccioni to indicate that we all know it. Every night when we fall asleep, well, we lose consciousness at times, but then we regain it too when we are still disconnected on the input and output side from the world. When we dream, a dream can be as vivid as anything during wake, and it's all made up inside. It has nothing to do with the world outside, here and now. And finally, and that's very important from a medical point of view, consciousness is not just responsiveness. We should have known that in the sense that when we are dreaming, indeed, we are typically unresponsive. Well, some patients, like the one shown here, may be completely unresponsive. You literally cannot wake her up no matter what you do. You will get no response. But that doesn't mean necessarily that there is nobody there. Very often that's true. But sometimes, and this is a classic landmark study that showed it, sometimes you can actually convince yourself that there is somebody there because, for instance, you can do an Fmri experiment in which you image the brain of the patient, which you can see down here. When you ask the patient who's not saying anything, doing anything, you have no idea that the person is really there. But for 40 seconds, say, think about playing tennis. She was an avid tennis player. Or think about navigating through her house. And the lights that you see shining in her brain are exactly in the same places where you see them shining in you and me if we were asked the same task. So clearly there is strong indication, now we have more and more data about this, that there is somebody there because the brain gets activated in a very similar way, even though there is no outward response. So consciousness is not just responsiveness. Now, back to the hard problem mentioned by Michele. I think the best illustration of the problem goes back to one of the greatest philosophers, Leibniz, 300 and more years ago, who essentially used a metaphor, the metaphor of the mill, and said, look, take the most complicated object they knew about then, let's say a mill, with lots of pulleys and gears and so on, and imagine it very, very big so you can walk into it and just see all these gears and these ropes pulling each other. And of course, he was thinking of the brain that we see now on the right, as what you have seen in the past days from the Human Connectome Project, for instance, or the Human Blue Brain Project. And here, this is an electron microscopy slide that is actually taken in our lab, in which you can see one of the connections between neurons. This is a presynaptic terminal with all the vesicles here containing glutamate, and this is the postsynaptic spine where the electrochemical transmission occurs. And by the way, when philosophers come into the lab, I often show them on the screen of some of the students in the lab, these kind of pictures to show that when you look into the brain, it's an incredibly dense entity that's completely full with these synapses and mitochondria and glial cells. It's a completely dense thing, okay? It's a piece, incredible piece of biological machinery. But Leibniz thought a long time ago, make it very big, walk inside it, touch all these vesicles, and what are you going to find? You're going to find just mechanical things, vesicles releasing transmitters and so on. He would say now, yes, it's electrochemical, it's not just mechanical, but still, it's a machine. And there is no way that we can understand how a machine that goes through the motions, does what it does, would somehow generate consciousness or explain a perception, as he put it. So there's really no better way of putting the problem. Or there's another way to put it, which is here with reference to the wedding at Cana. it seems really as if we try to explain consciousness in physical terms, we are doing something like transforming the gray water of the brain into the red wine of experience, okay? A miracle, literally. And miracles are not what science typically deals with. Now, what I think is that we need to understand consciousness by starting from consciousness itself and not doing what Galileo taught us to do, which is to always start from the physical world and remove the subject from the equation. For consciousness, you cannot remove the subject from the equation. The subject of investigation is the subject himself or herself. And so we shouldn't go from physics and try to squeeze experience, colors and shapes and sounds and space and time from the brain. You'll never do that and then get to phenomenology. You have to do exactly the opposite. You have to start from the phenomenon, literally the phenomenon you want to understand, which is experience itself, and see if there is a way to account for it, to explain it in terms of physics. Consciousness is first, experience is first, also for scientists. And physics is something we dreamt up from within experience. We have to emphasize this because you cannot make progress on consciousness if you don't realize that that must be your starting point. And this is indeed what integrated information theory, IIT, tries to do. It starts from experience itself, phenomenology, not from the behaviors that you perform when you're conscious, not from the remarkable functions, including language, that you can do when you're conscious, and certainly not from what's happening in the brain. That's not where the solution is going to be found. You're just going to get more behaviors, more functions, and more neural correlates. Instead, we need to look at the phenomenon itself. We need to look at experience. And the point of start for IIT is to identify what are the essential properties of every experience, which it calls axioms. We'll see them very briefly in a moment. Then translate these properties into physical properties, properties that a physical system must satisfy to actually account for experience, which it calls postulates. And then aim at accounting for the way experience feels when there is experience and how it feels, that is, space, time, shapes, colors, and so on and so forth, in terms of physical properties. The physical gives us an explanation of the phenomenon, but not vice versa. So let me begin this brief, very, very cursory overview of the theory itself, going back to Descartes, that Michele brought up, and saying indeed that the starting point is a very Cartesian one, is we should start from experience itself, what it is like to be, which is really phenomenal existence. That is what exists immediately and indubitably. And then translate that in terms of physical existence. Now, physical is not very often well defined, but actually, I want to quote another philosopher here. We actually don't know who he was. This is known as the Eleatic stranger who walks in a Platonic dialogue, the sophist, a very difficult dialogue, and at some point comes up and presents the criteria for the physical. And to him, the physical is basically cause-effect power. Whatever takes or makes a difference, even a minimal difference, that's what exists in physical terms. And I do take this actually very seriously. It's a perfectly good operational definition of what we accept as physical, including the Higgs boson. Unless you can actually show that it can take and make a difference, nobody would agree that it exists. Okay, so that's the criterion for physical existence. And by the way, you find this not just in the Eleatic stranger, some people thought it may have been Parmenides, but also in some Oriental traditions. For instance, in Buddhism, Dharmakirti had a very, very similar definition of existence in terms of cause-effect power, or more generally, causal power. So now what IIT does, it says, let's start then from what for sure exists, which is phenomenal existence experience, and ask, are there some properties that are essential, that is, that are immediately and indubitably true of every conceivable experience? Some properties that are always true. And it says there are 5 such properties. So if experience exists, no doubt, well, every experience, says IIT, is intrinsic or subjective. It exists for me, from the inside, not from somebody else, from the outside. It is structured, that's composition. Say, I can always distinguish, say, a left and the right, a bed and a book and a body and the color of the book, and is related to the book itself, so it's a blue book and so on. So every experience is extraordinarily structured. If you wish, it has parts related to each other phenomenally. Every experience is specific. We're having this particular experience, say, when I wake up again from a nap, and that experience is the way it is. It cannot be generic. Nobody ever could have a generic experience. It's this experience, this body, this bed, this book, this color, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, is what makes that experience different from many others. But the key is that experience is specific. It's also unified or integrated. Every experience is one thing that you are having, and if it weren't, there would be two people, one seeing the left, say, and one seeing the right. But it's never true. You cannot have an experience which is not one. And finally, every experience is definite in the Latin sense of having borders. It contains what it contains, not less and not more. The experience I'm having is not half of what I'm having, or a quarter or a third, and it's not more, like seeing behind my back or anything like that. So these properties are so fundamental that we typically don't notice them. Not even Descartes had really pointed out these things. He had understood the integration part, but he didn't really say these are true of every conceivable experience. So let's say they are, and without going into that there are no other properties that are true of every conceivable experience. And then the next step that IIT does is says, well, can we account for what exists, phenomenal experience, in physical terms, given that physical explanations have been very powerful in accounting for, in general, the regularity of experience, where physical, as I mentioned, is cause-effect power. That is, taking and making a difference. Say, let's take the brain, which we know has something very intimate to do with consciousness, at least some parts of it. And, physically, we can observe, for instance, neurons. We can see whether they are on or off. We can perturb them, turn them on and turn them off, see what difference they make to other neurons, and so on and so forth. That is literally what neuroscience does. It performs physical investigations of the physical subset of consciousness. Now here is the translation, that's the difficult part, if you wish, in IIT, of the 5 essential properties of consciousness in terms of cause-effect power. That is, from phenomenal properties to physical properties. So a system, for instance, to be able to support consciousness, it follows, must have cause-effect power upon itself, intrinsically, in a structured way, so its parts must have cause-effect power within the whole. It must have cause-effect power that is specific, the particular way it is. It must have cause-effect power as a single entity. It cannot be subdivided into causally independent components. And finally, it must have borders. Borders both in space and time, if you wish, and in grain. It must have borders where the substrate of consciousness ends, not less and not more. It's not my entire body, it's not my body and the floor on which I stand, it's not my body and the floor and the world, and it's also not just an individual neuron. It's something having to do with a piece of the brain. They're still trying to figure out which one, but it has borders, and there must be an explanation for that. So that is really the starting point of IIT, and the ending point of IIT, from a theoretical point of view, is an identity. It's an explanatory identity. We say that one experience, say this particular one I'm having the moment I wake up, is identical to a cause-effect structure. Keep in mind, it is a structure. What the structure is the unfolding, that's the word we use, of the powers, the cause-effect power of a substrate. Take this piece of the brain. I have reasons to show this back of the cerebral cortex here, with some neurons on, some off, some intermediate, things that as scientists we can observe and manipulate. But that's not really what exists in physical terms. That's what everybody thinks exists, a bunch of neurons connect in a certain way. But what really exists physically, properly done, is the entire set of cause-effect powers of this substrate. And that is indicated here with a very simple diamond-like structure, a gigantic cause-effect structure that IIT tells you, in principle, how to unfold. And then the amount of existence, in physical terms, of this structure is given by the quantity phi, or phi, that was mentioned by Viviana. It tells you how much it exists, how reducible it is, how much of an entity it is. And its quality is essentially the shape, the form of this cause-effect structure, all its causal distinctions, they are called, and the causal relations, which are the way these distinctions overlap. So obviously, I can't really do justice to this. It's rather long, and there is a lot of mathematics involved, but the concepts actually are simple. Consciousness exists. That's our starting point for everything. If that were gone, there would be nothing. Consciousness has 5 essential properties, the one I mentioned. We can translate existence in physical terms from within consciousness, because consciousness is first, and that means cause-effect power. And we can translate those essential properties in physical terms. And in the end, we get that what is identical to consciousness, says the theory, is a cause-effect structure. Is that true? Well, this is something we can test. Indeed, IAT is a scientific theory, and therefore it has explanatory, predictive, and inferential power. And I'll quickly go through this, starting with 2 things I always thought were central, that if we don't understand them, we don't understand anything about consciousness in the brain. One is, we know that consciousness has something to do with the cerebral cortex up here, and nothing to do with the cerebellum down here. The cerebellum has 70 billion neurons. In fact, most of the neurons in the brain are there. They are smaller, but they are there. The cortex altogether has 16 billion neurons, so a fifth or so. Yet, if you take out the cerebellum, consciousness doesn't suffer at all. I mean, you have problems moving around a bit, you're uncoordinated, but your consciousness, what you hear and see and think and feel, stays the same. But if you take out the cerebral cortex completely, you're gone, you don't exist anymore. So what's the difference? The cerebellum has more neurons, has as many connections, is connected to the cerebral cortex itself, is connected to the body, it has maps of the world, it can control movement and so on. So what the hell is wrong with the cerebellum? We need to understand that. And the other example is the one I mentioned at the beginning, something we know every night when we fall into dreamless sleep, which is typically early in the night. Well, initially people thought the brain would shut off and neurons would not be active. But here is a work we did together with Itzhak Fried in California in epileptic patient, where you can actually record individual neurons, which are all these little vertical bars are a neuron firing. In wake, they fire. These are 6 neurons here in a particular area of the cortex of this subject. In deep sleep, when you're not there, they also fire roughly the same amount. There are these brief periods of silence for a fraction of a second, but it's not that the brain is not active. It's not that the cortex is not active, and yet you are gone. You don't exist anymore. We need to be able to explain that. And so very, very briefly, the theory does that, at least in principle. It shows that if you have the anatomy of certain parts of the cerebral cortex, like especially in the back here, you indeed are a good substrate that when you unfold its powers, specifies a cause-effect structure of high phi, that is, that can be highly conscious. But if you take the cerebellum, even though it has many more neurons, once you unfold its substrate, instead of getting one big cause-effect structure, it fragments into a lot of very, very small things indicated here, mini cause-effect structures. Basically, it's very modular, and it's all feed-forward. On top of that, it's also largely inhibitory. But whatever it is, it has really the wrong anatomy to support consciousness if IAT is correct. Now, the anatomy is not enough. Here now we have again the back of the cerebral cortex, which has sort of the right anatomy. If you unfold it, you get a big cause-effect structure. Now we take this little model and we put it into deep sleep when we are unconscious by changing the neuromodulators, particularly noradrenaline and acetylcholine. What happens is the connections are still there, but their efficacy is greatly reduced through various mechanisms which we have investigated for a long time. But be it as may, if that is the case, suddenly the same anatomy now does not support this big cause-effect structure, but disintegrates into these little things which are worth nothing, basically. And this is work done in the laboratory of Marcello Massimini in Milan, who has actually shown in an epileptic patient that when you go from wakefulness into the early non-REM sleep, when consciousness is often lost, indeed the causal interactions among the neurons in the cortex break down, just as predicted by IAT. You can see this blue here. That basically means that the neurons are bistable, they fall into an off period, and then they come back and they fire again, but with no causal connection to what was happening before, as indicated also here. So the causal interactions break down, consciousness is gone. Now, predictive power. I'll give you just a few examples. A long time ago, also with Marcello Massimini, we try to test a very basic prediction of the theory by using transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is this butterfly thing here, in which you can use a strong magnetic field very briefly to induce a current inside the cerebral cortex. And then we record how the brain responds using these EEG electrodes, several of them. So basically what you do is you knock on the brain like that, and you see whether the brain responds and how it responds. And what turns out to be the case, and now it's been confirmed many, many, many times, is that when you're awake and conscious, you knock on the brain here, you get a very broad integrated response that is complex. It changes over a fraction of a second, which corresponds very crudely to high information integration. It would be high 5 if we could measure it properly. Early non-REM sleep, when consciousness is lost, instead you knock the same way on the same spot on the brain, but the response you get is just local. It remains local, it doesn't go anywhere, and it lasts very little, low information integration. And finally, that was more difficult to do, but in REM sleep, where most of the time you're conscious, you knock here and you get a response that's very similar to the one you see in wake. So indicating that this complex integrated response of the brain to a perturbation is actually consistent with high information integration with consciousness, which indeed is the case because you are dreaming. And then we went on and did several experiments in which we went through, for instance, anesthetics of different kinds. This is wake. You can see this complex response now in time over DEG, indicating high information integration. You are conscious. And now this is a benzodiazepine in high doses. You go unconscious. The response is local and stereotypical. Propofol, typical anesthetic. The response is local and stereotypical. Xenon, a very different anesthetic. You also become completely unconscious. The response is stereotypical. It's not complex. And then here's the key one, ketamine, which is an anesthetic that puts you completely unresponsive. You can do surgery, no problem. But actually, most people dream very vividly. And this is one of our subjects saying, when she came out of it, I was Frodo on Mount Doom, and she went on telling us this extraordinarily vivid dream, okay? The response, notice, even the subject was completely unresponsive, is very similar to the one you see during wakefulness or during REM sleep, indicating that this is a good marker for consciousness as predicted by the theory. And in fact, the work of Massimini and his collaborators, and some of our work too, has confirmed this. These are many, many, many subjects, normal subjects who are awake. And these red points here indicate the value of an index called perturbational complexity index that tells you how complex the response is. It's sort of correlated to the ability to integrate information of the brain. It's always high when you're conscious. Importantly, it's also high when you're conscious and unresponsive, as I showed you in dreaming and during ketamine anesthesia. It's also high when patients with serious neurological lesions, like this is the locked-in syndrome, totally unresponsive patient who may be able maybe to move up and down the eyelid to communicate, but they are definitely there, no doubt about it. Or subcortical strokes, cortical strokes, or when they come out of a coma or an unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, they come back, they are there, they obviously conscious. This index is always high. And here on the left in blue, you see instead many conditions of unconsciousness, the classic ones, deep non-REM sleep, and these various anesthetics. The index is always very low. So we can draw a line here, and above this, we have an index of when you are conscious, and below when you are not, with almost perfect sensitivity and specificity that we can use to gauge consciousness independent of the subject ability to respond. And this is very important in the clinic. And in fact, there are now more than 300 patients that have been tested this way, and we're trying to build a tool to do this in a way that can be made available to every hospital, basically. Use this index, for instance, in minimally conscious patients that a good neurologist can say they're probably there, maybe because they track a little bit with your eyes, but it's a very difficult assessment. The index is always high, telling you they are there. But then the interesting thing happens when you go to patients who are unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. It used to be called vegetative state. Here you can see that the index is either 0 in black here, or in blue here at levels that we find in normal subjects during deep sleep or anesthesia, or in green here in levels that you find in perfectly conscious subjects. So suddenly we can see here, which confirms what I showed you at the beginning in the study of the lady playing tennis that didn't respond at all, but could somehow do it in her mind, or at least in her brain, that there are probably 20-25% of patients in this unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, so-called vegetative patients, who are presumably there, and others who instead are not. And this is very important clinically, also in terms of what you can do, because the black ones that had the zero value, well, truly, I think we can tell the relatives that there is nobody there at all. The ones who were in the green, blue area, which have a response like you see in deep sleep or anesthesia, are candidates for being awakened again. Whether you do it with deep brain stimulation, with focused ultrasound, or with drugs, is a difficult thing to do, but now new techniques are coming up. These are candidates for being awoken. And finally, the ones in green here that have a response which is as complex as you and me when we are awake or dreaming, those are candidates for restoring communication to brain-machine interfaces. They are there. They are just not telling us. They are not communicating. So can we go into their brain and establish a communication? So there are obviously important clinical implications. Now I want to briefly mention some of the fundamental work that's been done now. We've done this for quite some time now. It's sort of ready. Using data collected by the Human Connectome project, more than 160 subjects we've used using 7T and 3T fMRI, so powerful instruments. So this is the best quality data there are in subjects who were either doing nothing, just being scanned, or they were performing 7 different tasks. And we did an analysis based on what each voxel in the cortex, more generally in the brain, were doing. So roughly 32,000 voxels per hemisphere, 64,000 over the brain. So it's a detailed analysis. A voxel is still a lot of neurons, probably more than 100,000 or so. So it's not as fine as we would like to, not in space and not in time, but it's certainly better than anything else we have at this point. And then we've developed a way to roughly measure phi, integrated information, to assess which parts of the cortex can support consciousness. And so we did that, and we looked at different parts of the brain. For instance, the cerebellum here, which we know doesn't matter for consciousness, has exceedingly low value of phi, even with all these caveats about how we measure it. If you take the front of the cerebral cortex, which is very important from some of the most sophisticated functions human can perform, well, that is a very low value too. But if you go to the back of the cerebral cortex, the value jumps up. This is a logarithmic scale, so this is immensely higher. The back is very good for integrated information. And then if you take the entire brain, the value is low again. So it's not just a matter of getting bigger. Integrated information requires a substrate which has borders of maximum integration. And it looks like the back is good. In fact, we can go further and try to find this maximum. Again, we need to make lots of approximation, but you can see here in red, yellow, and green, which parts of the brain, or more precisely the cortex, this is the lateral side, this is the medial side that is here in the middle, are part of this maximum of phi, which is what IAT says should be the subset of consciousness. This is during the resting state, meaning they're not asleep, they're just thinking and of nothing or whatever goes through their mind, but not performing any task. This is watching a movie. You see, by and large, it's the same areas plus more of what is here, auditory cortex and visual cortex, but it's primarily in the back, as I mentioned to you before. So this is from first principles. We don't have here a hypothesis whether it's the front, the back, the cortex, the cerebellum. This is purely based on the properties of consciousness. The phenomenal properties are those 5. We translate them into physical properties, cause-effect power. Where do we find the maximum of cause-effect power that IIT says should be the subset of experience? We find it in the back of the cerebral cortex primarily. So it's literally from first principles. Now, is that correct, that we identify the maximum primarily in the back? There are many reasons to think that there is something right about it. One study that we did a few years ago, and it was a long study, was actually to exploit one of the best ways to look for the neural correlates of consciousness, what's different in the brain when you're conscious and when you're not. When this is done between wake and sleep, for instance, many things change, or between wake and anesthesia, many things change beyond consciousness. But there is one case in which we can have a much cleaner comparison, and that is sleep, especially non-REM sleep. When you sleep, we have now done more than 300 subjects, a third of the time you are completely unconscious in non-REM sleep. And 2/3 of the time, you are dreaming. It can be a vivid dream, a long dream, a short dream, but there is some consciousness. So we can compare when your brain is conscious, dreaming, and when your brain is not conscious, within the same brain, when you're doing no task whatsoever, there are no confounding factors, and you're roughly in the same state. You're lying in a bed, unresponsive, and there are slow waves going on in your brain, as is typically in non-REM sleep. And what are the areas that show a difference? It's primarily the back, lateral surface, medial surface. In blue and green, you see the areas where there is a reduction of slow waves, those slow waves that are typical of non-REM sleep. When they go down and these areas get activated, you are conscious. So this tells us the neural correlate seems to be primarily in the back. Now this is REM sleep, which look very, very different from the point of view of the electroencephalogram and also the fMRI. But again, the very same regions show up primarily in the back of the brain. So this is strong evidence that indeed these areas are key for being conscious rather than not. And if you look at the classic neurological evidence, in fact, you find remarkable things. This doesn't happen anymore, but this is a patient from 1930 or so, Brickner's patient, in which they literally took out all of the front of the cortex, prefrontal cortex. This is the left side, this is the right side. They, at the time, to be safe and not kill any vessels and risk hemorrhage, they went in, you can read the report of the surgeon, with the fingers scooping out first the left side of the front of the brain of this poor patient. And 2 weeks later, because he wasn't getting really much better, they did the right side. And the patient came out perfectly fine. In fact, he started talking when they took out all this piece of the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is not useless. It's very important for many things we do as humans. And the patient indeed had what is now called the Frontal Syndrome. He was disinhibited. He could not really change what he was doing very easily, many other aspects of lack of flexibility and so on. But consciousness, oh, no doubt he was conscious. He could hear and see and feel and think and have emotions, okay? Now, if instead you look over the literature at big lesions in the posterior part of the cortex, well, there are not too many cases of this sort. 200 or so are the one properly reported, but they basically never came out of an unresponsive syndrome. Basically, they are staying vegetative. So the evidence suggests that, and there's much more I should say, including recording studies and stimulation studies when you stimulate the brain, that the back of the cortex seems to be really fundamental for us having experiences, and it's where IIT says there is a maximum of cause-effect power. Now, IIT is rather unique in trying to do the following. Not only to account for why we are conscious under what condition and what piece of the brain or any piece of matter, if you wish, is important for it and why, but also you don't have a theory of consciousness if you cannot, in principle, account for the way it feels. Not just that it feels, but the way it feels. Why space feels extended. I started with a picture, for instance, of your room and your body. It's all extended. Your body feels extended. You look at the sky, it feels extended. You look at the blank screen, it feels extended. You look at the wall, it feels extended. And feeling extended, although almost nobody really paid attention to it, is just as much the hard problem as feeling red or feeling pain, okay? It just feels that particular way. Why is that? And the same is true for why does time feel like it's flowing? It's not magic. There must be an explanation. It must be physics and not magic, okay? Why do objects feel the way they do? That there is a general bound to a particular, that when you see this triangle here, it is this particular triangle at this place in black with a brown border, but it's also a triangle. And you experience all of that at the same time, all the concepts that came out in previous presentations. What matters is when we feel them consciously. Same is true for faces. And then, of course, why does red feel red, blue feel blue, pain feel pain, and so on and so forth. All of this must have a scientific explanation, but it's an objective explanation of the subjective, not of what we do, but what we are. So I just give you a very, very brief indication, I can't really explain this, of how now IIT, finally, this is our main research program, is trying to account for the quality of experience. So here we are taking a very simple physical substrate. In this case, it's just 8 neurons connected by nearest neighbor connections like that, all off in this particular case, as you find them in the back of the cortex. We unfold in full the cause-effect powers of this substrate. And I told you What exists physically is not what we normally think, a bunch of neurons. That is what you can perturb and observe. But what really exists is the cause-effect power, which is a gigantic cause-effect structure, part of which is indicated here of these stupid 8 little binary neurons, okay? This is part of the unfolded cause-effect power. And we show, as predicted by IIT, that the properties of this cause-effect structure of this particular substrate can actually account for the extendedness of space. Why you actually have an experience of space where you can find spots of any size at any position, that they are overlapping with each other, connection, that they can form larger spots or unfuse into smaller spots, that every spot includes spots or is included by spots. These are fundamental properties of spatial experience. There must be an identity to a cause-effect structure. And there is, we show that, and that's only true for the cause-effect structure that you unfold from a grid, but not from any kind of neural anatomy. And then other properties of space, that there are regions of space that they have their location within the overall space, their size, their boundaries, and their distance. When you look out, everything is the proper distance from everything else. You don't need to calculate anything. You don't compute a damn thing. You just see it, okay? That is all captured by the cause-effect structure specified by a grid. And guess what? If you look at the brain, we see that most of the back of the brain, where already we suspect is the subset of consciousness, is organized like grids. 38% here. These are all grid-like areas with lateral connections among neurons and then grids stacked on top of grids. I like to say pyramids of grids. That is indeed a perfect substrate for having hi-fi, for being conscious, and conscious how? Primarily in a spatial manner. I will finish now with the inferential power of IIT. So if a theory is supported by the data, makes reasonable prediction, can explain many, many different things, then you begin to trust the theory and use it instead of your gut feelings to deal with difficult situations. Is there consciousness if a patient, say, has a sea of destruction in the brain, but a few islands in the brain that are still strongly active almost normally? You can't really resolve that philosophically. You need a theory that tells you, with an island like this, will there be consciousness, how much, and of what? It could be pain, you want to know that, or it could not be anything you worry about. Newborns, this is a PET scan of a newborn, this is 1 year old. The newborn, there's hardly any activity in the cortex, only in the amygdala. And so we could use the theory to begin to ask, is there going to be something it's like to be a newborn baby or not? You're really still a little bit of a biological machine that cries, but not with much consciousness. And then does it begin to really flourish, for instance, at 1 year or not? I'm not saying we have the answer, but I'm saying there is a principal approach. Or take an octopus. I like it. It's a favorite animal, not just because it's intelligent, but indeed because it has a very alien brain. It has a little brain in each of the limbs, 8, plus a central brain, which is twice as big. And then these brains are connected. So if you look at it, you can't really say without a theory, is it conscious at all? Is there one octopus consciousness? Are there 9 or 8? And who knows, okay? Well, if we can actually unfold the substrate, we should be able to know whether they have consciousness, how many, how much, and of what kind. And here are 2 other examples that are becoming very important now. That's where I'm going to go. Organoids, brains in a dish, which are being grown much, much more than it was possible now, very quickly developed for various reasons, but they bring up lots of neuroethical concerns. Is there something it is like to be an organoid? Under what conditions? And of course, computers. You heard from Michele, the computationalist view of mind, the functionalist view of mind. What does IT have to say about that? Well, it's very clear. We have proven now that if IIT is roughly right, then a powerful general artificial intelligence, that is a very powerful computer that runs very powerful software that can perform basically all the things we perform. We're not there yet, but we are going in that direction. Or even, which is far in the future, a detailed simulation of our brain, despite what you heard from the Blue Brain project, we're definitely not there. Well, you could do all of this in a computer. In fact, there is a lot of money being poured into doing this with computers. But if IIT is right, well, we have to be careful about what we're doing. Here is the very, very quick indication of what we demonstrated in a paper that is being submitted. Here is a very little system of 5 neurons, say, in a particular state. Here it's unfolded cause-effect structure, what really exists physically. It has a low value of 5, but it's not nothing, and it has a particular form. Here is a much bigger system of 66 logic gates rather than 5, connected to be a little universal computer with registers, a clock, and the arithmetic logical unit, and so on. This system can be programmed to be functionally equivalent to the one on the left. It does exactly the same things. The input-output function is exactly the same. So if you put them in a black box, from the outside, they are indistinguishable. But if you unfold this thing, even if it is much more complicated looking, it has 0 phi. It doesn't exist. There is no consciousness whatsoever. In fact, all you get is what I call dust. Some little pieces of this computer are mini entities worth basically nothing, that are nothing to do with, have nothing to do with what is being simulated. So you can expand this because this is totally general. If you take the brain, of course, it's much more than this, the back of the brain here, and you were to unfold it, you would get, we presume, a gigantic cause-effect structure, which at every moment is identical with the experience I'm having. If I were to simulate either my functions or my brain with a giant computer, that computer would be from the outside indistinguishable from me. It would do all the same things. You can put it in a body like mine and it's going to be indistinguishable. But if IT is right, there is nothing there. The computer doesn't exist. What exists is this dust, these mini entities that have nothing to do with what really is there, which is my consciousness. And so here is the maximum of IT. Doing is not being, okay? We are in a functionalist zeitgeist now. The world is going functional. What we care about, whether something is intelligent and what it does things. We have supercomputers that are getting better than us as answering questions, cars that drive themselves better or almost as well as we do. And of course, the computers can give answers to questions now, like many human beings, sometimes better, sometimes not yet, granted, but certainly better than many, many patients who instead are there, they are conscious. Yet, IT tells you that if it is done on a computer, there is no way these things are there. And they should be treated accordingly. They should be means and not ends in themselves. And even computers like the Blue Brain project here that were simulating how our own brain works, but simulated in a digital computer, so the hardware is like this, would have 0 consciousness. And you know what you see in the movies, this is one classic example, is Ex Machina. You know, one day they may literally look like us, be remarkably intelligent, even more than we are, maybe be nicer than we are, which is not that hard to do after all. And yet, if IT is right, there would be nothing there. And so what happens is we have been used to this correlation between consciousness and intelligence. We are intelligent, and when we are conscious, we're intelligent, and when we are not conscious, we are not. So conscious and intelligence go together in us, typically. And so we look at the animal and plant kingdom and so on in the same way. We tend to think maybe a dog is probably conscious because his intelligence, not as much as I am, but you know, it probably sees and hears at least that much and so on. It may not have language, but. And then we don't really know anymore here, but we suspect they are not that intelligent, so they're probably not conscious. But again, IT says there is complete dissociation in principle. This only happens, and we showed it, because under natural selection, there is pressure for developing integrated architectures which are both conscious and intelligent. But you can have an organoid in which there is no intelligence whatsoever. It's lying in a dish, doing nothing, no inputs, no outputs, and yet it could be highly conscious depending on the circumstances. And vice versa, you can have a supercomputer which is much better than we are or does the same things we do, and is not there at all. So I'll finish by reminding you then of the fundamental identity of IIT, that an experience, which is what consciousness is identical to a cause-effect structure, the unfolded cause-effect power of a physical subject. And every phenomenal property has to be one-to-one corresponding to a physical property of this causal kind. And I want to finish, because that was my title, by telling you that in principle, I strongly suspect, and I want to share that this is going, if it is true, and we can substantiate it by looking at our brain, where we can actually do the experimental validation of what consciousness existence really is. We can do scientific metaphysics, if you wish. It tells us a very different story from the one we have been taught since the time of Galileo about what the universe is like and what actually exists. What we have been all taught now by science, and of course, I am the first one to be impressed with what science has been able to do, is that we really are just a little speck of matter living on, say, a small planet in the corner of a modest universe, a modest galaxy near a modest star. And the galaxy is one out of many of a universe that maybe is even expanding very rapidly and may not even be the only one. That's what we're being taught. And of course, our own existence is just a flare of life for an instant over the eternity of time. Okay? That's what we have been taught. That's the picture that we all have that is becoming more and more in contrast with the humanistic worldview that we initially started with. But if IT is right, it's very likely that this view of the world is utterly wrong. We got it completely upside down, or better, I should say, outside in. Okay? It's likely that all these giant galaxies are really not much more, most of them at least, than an aggregate of dust, of these many little entities that don't really exist much in and of themselves. They exist for us, but not for themselves. That the sublime mountains and oceans that we are inevitably led to admire when we go to the top of a mountain and look down of the immensity of nature, well, those too are really not much more, probably, most of it, than an aggregate of dust. And even, sorry for the embodiment crowd, even our own body, the body that we see and we feel so strongly, okay, lying on the bed, our own body is really just an aggregate of dust. That is possibly cells, and cells, each cell may be a little entity, but worth very little, existing minimally, intrinsically for itself. And instead, what really exists, what are really the large entities in the universe, is our own experience, within which my body is a structure, a form in the mind that exists within the mind as a body. The mountains and the sea are forms within the mind that exist only within the mind, in the only way that something truly exists. And the universe itself does not exist as such. It exists for each and every one of us as a giant form in the mind, a concept through which we attempt to capture everything, but only within our own consciousness. And when I say our own, of course, I mean my own and that of every fellow human and animal being, each one a universe of consciousness. Thank you.
È molto difficile riprendere a parlare.
It's so difficult to resume speaking after these visionary presentations. I really feel not up to it, almost. But first of all, I wanted to ask Professor Tononi, can we continue in Italian? Is it okay for you to have the Q&A session in Italian? And so I'd like to ask a very simple thing. So how did you get to the definition of phi? Because this is a mathematical equation, so it's interesting also to know that there are people saying that in the end the whole world has been built according to this. So our idea of beauty depends on the proportions of the golden section that we see of the phi. Can you give an explanation? Yes, there is an assonance between phi and the so-called golden section, even if obviously philologists will probably disagree with me. Now, the idea of phi is in reality that of measuring irreducibility. So the extent to which something is above the parts that make it up. And the way we can do this is physical. So what we literally do is we're doing a causal cut between one part of the system and the rest of the system. We need to do this for any part because we need to be able to find the weakest section. And when we cut the system in 2 or 3 parts, we see what a difference it makes. If it makes no difference, for instance, if we take two entities which are completely separate, causal, me here and somebody in New Zealand at the moment, so on the opposite side of the world, if we separate that system in two, nothing much changes, obviously, in this case. The phi is equal to 0. It tells us that the entity made up by that person in New Zealand and myself does not exist as a single entity. Its irreducibility is equal to 0, and so basically it doesn't exist as such. Maybe I can exist, that person exists, but we don't exist together, the two of us together. Generalizing, we can see any system, the human body, a cell, the brain, the cerebellum, the whole brain, a part of the brain. And for each one of these, we can operate all of these sections, these cuts, to see how irreducible they are. So literally, phi is a quantifier of existence. To what extent something exists is measured by how much irreducible it is, and the phi that matters is the quantity of the maximum quantity of existence. It's what is called the principle of maximum existence, that vaguely resembles to Leibniz, because he went quite close. So the idea that amongst all of the possible existence, what really exists is what exists at the maximum. This is the principle, the one that has the maximum phi value. So basically, it beats all of the other existence. I like this because it once again connects the topic of our evening, science and philosophy. So at this point, I wanted to ask Professor Michele Di Francesco. So I wanted to ask you this. We heard about cause and effect. But cause-effect recently has been quite separate. We talk about causes, multiple causes. We call about network system. How does philosophy respond to this? This is a question for both of you. Is the concept of cause-effect still valid, a cause producing an effect? Is it still valid as a concept? Okay, I can start. I think it depends on the context in which this question is asked. From a certain point of view, it is well known, and it's been known for time, that the identification, so the distinction between cause and background conditions, is not that easy. Let's imagine, for instance, that there may be a car accident on a Saturday evening. So if we want to look for the cause, we could go and look and see if, for instance, if we're the police, so we want to see if the person on board is drunk, or if we are the car manufacturers, we want to see if there are any structural problems. If we are the mayor of a city, we want to see if there were problems on the streets, like holes. And if talking about multiple causes or causes is this, maybe, but I would say that from a physical standpoint, it's quite dubious if causes have to be taken as really existing entities in the quantistic description of the world. I mean, this is a notion that appears on all levels. In the philosophy of the mind, I still find it as a useful notion to be used, even if obviously debates are ongoing on this. And what about science? There's always been a great mistrust vis-à-vis causality in science. Obviously, Hume had a rather complex vision on this, so you can mention Hume in favor or against the existence of causality. As he was saying, it's simply something that happens. It's a series of things, but there's nothing beyond this. It's only this, a series. Or has been said, one time thing after the other. Nothing more than that. But in reality, whilst physics was quite skeptical because the idea is to describe what happens with differential equations in classic and quantistic terms, instead, biology is absolutely causal. It's all based on mechanism. It's a mechanicistic par excellence. So in this sense, it refers to Descartes rather than to contemporary physics. And this is absolutely true. I think that the physicist is defined as a causal power in the theory that I mentioned. So we should differentiate from the causal and the causal potentials of a state. That is what we do when we, for instance, do this unfolding of physical substrate to demonstrate what exists. It's not the substrate, it's the unfolded substrate in its causal potential. And what it's called instead the actual causation, which is what people normally think, what causes the next event, what goes from one state to the other, what has caused this accident, what has caused this particle to be disintegrated, what has caused the fact that the neuron has, downloaded or not. And also the current causality, which is important to understand what happens, can be studied. And in reality, there's this work that's been done with the same principles, basically, the fundamental principles of intrinsic nature, specificity, integration, and definition. So these same to assess what causes what, where it is fundamental to understand that there are composite causes, that there are background conditions as well, as you mentioned. And so in this sense, it is perfectly possible to talk about causes and to characterize them mathematically. But all this is a recent evolution. Our work was only done last year, for instance, so there is still a lot of confusion in interpreting causation, denying it, or seeing it also in mechanicistic or biological terms. But above all, the different thing is to quantify it and to differentiate the potential one from the actual one. So we have so many questions, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time. And so as I will be addressing to our two experts the last question, I would ask Professor Comi and Professor Cacciari to please join me for the final conclusions. Professor Comi, together with Miuccia Prada and together with Professor Cacciari, have obviously started this Human Brains project. And Professor Comi is also the president of our scientific committee, by the way. Massimo Cacciari, I mean, you've met Professor Comi before. Massimo Cacciari, I think, needs no words of introduction. He's very well known. So as you will be joining me, I will ask one last question, which maybe is only my curiosity. What space is there for free will in your vision today? The philosophical will, scientific will of consciousness. What is the space for free will? Who would like to start? Okay. Well, as a last question, not bad at all. I mean, I could make some comments. We debated a lot about free will in the framework of some results of neurosciences, of experiments of Lida, then Souls subsequently. And the outcome was quite dubious, I think, because neuroscience as such, I don't think that they are very much related to the solution of the metaphysical problem of free will. However, the discussion could be useful to clarify a few points. I mean, it has been shown that before, for instance, doing a certain action, there are certain parts of the brain which are already beginning to prepare for this action, and the action could be just folding a finger or a wrist. So a discussion has been initiated whether this was a good action, and then the decision it's been debated if the decision had not been already taken. What would really be surprising if there were a theory, a scientific theory, that could show that conscious thought does not have a causal role in determining actions. This would be very bad. I mean, instead, as far as free will is concerned, I mean, even if minds did not exist, we would have this anyways, in the sense that determinism is valid in our world. So, I mean, or is not. So I will just limit myself to this remark.
It's not really here that we can find a solution. Jules? Yeah. Well, here the conclusions are very different. I'd like to say that the greatest majority of my colleagues in psychology, neurosciences, and science in general cannot really see how is it possible to have space for free will once we understand the physical substrate of the brain. In other words, even if experiments haven't demonstrated it conclusively, the idea is that each neuron of the 85 billion in our brain decides whether to fire or not, depending on the inputs it receives. It does so. And if there is determinism or not, well, probably there will be a minimum causality. So in the end, what will happen is determined by neurons, each neuron on its own, and there is no space for free will. And Michele mentioned Hawkins, who said there is no space for any other causality apart from the microphysical one of what atoms and neurons do. And this is a vision that everybody has, even though it sounds impossible, because, free will seems to be my will of raising an arm, for instance. But science says no, there's nothing. It's neurons that define what we do. IIT states, in fact, that free will does exist in the fundamental and metaphysical meaning of the term. So when I cause an action, I consciously cause it and not my neurons. And this comes from another idea of IIT, i.e. what exists is consciousness. And when consciousness exists based on the axioms, neurons do no longer exist. They become part of consciousness. What literally exists is this cause-effect structure, this cause-effect power. This is what exists, and not the neurons, and only what exists can lead to a cause. This is a conclusion. So free will requires consciousness. So it is not sufficient to just have consciousness. You need some more understood by philosophy, religion, etc., to be able to keep your will to do something. But the more we are conscious, the more we can be free, and the more we have free will. Thank you. I'd like to thank you both. And please stay with us a few more minutes for the final conclusions that will be given by Massimo Cacciari and Giancarlo Comi, who are part of our scientific committee. Giancarlo is the president, but let's now leave the floor to Massimo. I mean, I would have liked him to be here to have a chat with Francesco, but unfortunately we have no time. Yes, especially on these last few notes on the issue of free will, which has always been a sort of caput mortuum of philosophy. It's interesting to see how some philosophers who got closer to this negation of free will, or the fact that free will has no foundation, are those which are, in fact, very far from science. A philosopher like Nietzsche, for instance, believes that free will was total imagination without any foundation. But I would like to limit myself as a spectator, almost. I'd like to simply underline the points that really struck me in the different presentations I followed this week. I'd start with Changeux, when by mentioning Lucretius also mentioned the ethical importance of our debate. And this is important. I mean, knowing not just the body, but also this product of evolution, which is our brain, which allows us one way or another to know the nature, and inside nature, the body, and inside the body, the brain, is a fact that is extremely important from the ethical viewpoint. The not knowing and not being curious about these aspects implies a political and ethical deficit. So this is what I believe, and this is the first point I wanted to stress. Then the debate focused around this theme of consciousness. Damasio said the gift of the self. And it's so wonderful that it induced many in our civilization to thinking that consciousness did not derive from a biological foundation. And so in our psyche, we would have a distinction between the sensitive and vegetative one from the ethical and rational one. Even though Michele Di Francesco said so, no philosophy went into vulgar and abstract dualism. The distinction we talked about has always takes place in the unity of the soul, the principle of life, the principle of a body that has life, at least a potential life. So basically, we always dealt not so much with dualism, but with an idea of regulation. It was necessary to make all possible efforts, and this is true for Descartes, for Spinoza, to make whatever effort so that the ethical part can guide us and can drive us through our reality. And I don't think this hope or idea has been abandoned by anybody, because it still remains true. And then the different reports explain, though, that consciousness, at least this is what I understood, and I agree with this, also from the physiological viewpoint, consciousness is not a subject that emerges from the mind and, directs. It's not the imaginary protagonist of this game. The symphony is produced by the orchestra itself while playing. To quote a poet, Pachago, the walking has no walking. So you fire an impulse, and the orchestra composes by playing and plays by composing. But I think that all reports also showed that this image would not be sufficient, because the orchestra, in fact, at least apparently, carries out a perfectly conscious job. Consciousness instead finds itself into the unconscious process, which is at the basis of consciousness, is an important theme where neurology, philosophy of the mind, anthropology, culture can, in fact, and should interact more so than in the past. Obviously, the primate of I think has been radically criticized by the whole of contemporary philosophy, but the complexity of nexus between conscious and unconscious has been clearly illustrated these days with great accuracy. The unconscious of the genome will have to be aggregated to the archetypical one and the cognitive one. Consciousness as such seems to be what emerges out of a huge iceberg. It's just the tip of the iceberg, and Changeux said so, which is simply what we can identify as the fundamental conatus, as Spinoza used to say, of any organism. The conatus of living, and by living, obviously developing your own shape and your own form. It's this free will of living. It's the anti-thermodynamic behavior of any living being. And this behavior manifests itself in the brain through the model of adaptation and coordination, of plasticity, of reaction to the environment it represents. The restless brain is what we heard. We have a restless brain, and we know this as nature and physicists. Nature is restless by nature. As Bergson used to say, mentioning Giordano Bruno without being aware of it, used to call nature a huge blossoming of unforeseeable news. And this restless brain, this brain that never rests, constitutes a global workspace. And this is what we've heard. In its maze, each element records. Recording takes place locally, but communication moves into the general neural workspace, the global neural workspace. And each word takes up its meaning in the context of a sentence. So the conference, in all its reports, moved towards a reductionistic perspective as well. The understanding, which becomes more and more accurate of the neuronal basis of our mind, does not mean explaining the event, which is highly unlikely, which is the revolutionary onset of subjectivity, as Damasio said. And subjectivity means singularity. The neurological common aspect does not explain, I think, the private nature of the mind. Many reports talked about a dramatic leap in this respect. More than one of the speakers used this expression when they talked about the language of thought that characterizes the human being. The language, or rather languages, in their essentially recursive character. With metaphysical scientists, the capability of the mind in its physical finiteness of understanding and perceiving what is not finite. It's true that nothing can be there which is not in the senses. This is true and has always been true, but it's true that the process starts from feelings, and the sphere of the self could never suppress the unconscious and emotional one, and Spinoza knew this very well. But it is also true that the intellect is not in the senses, i.e. cannot be reduced to the senses. So this dramatic leap allows us to explain the reasons of the dualistic mistake where those were present. The reductionistic perspectives, both scientific ones that reduce the mind to the brain, and philosophical ones, which are even more dangerous, that tend to select the mind as something separate, are based upon something which doesn't make sense, a superstitious vision of the cause-effect power. Therefore, already Hume, which has been mentioned before, should have healed us. The matter is open to what is spiritual. This is what real philosophy has always taught us, the real philosophy of nature. There is a disposition. This does not mean that this is a direct cause. From this point of view, epistemology at the basis of contemporary philosophy should be integrated with the current research on consciousness and the mind. And this is even truer if we look at the aspect which is of qualitative nature of consciousness phenomena, of creativity of the mind, for example. We should actually abstract from all of this to actually perceive a man-machine. Also, Descartes recognized this was impossible after all. Whatever machine can only have a limited number of physical states, and the mind, the language of the thought, has potentially an infinite number of them. We can conceive a machine that adapts and reacts to the environment and therefore modifies itself, that communicates to the environment in an unforeseeable manner when it is built. Well, I think this means asking, is it possible to build man? The answer is known, and also the means are known, and we've been knowing them for millions of years. The question that makes sense is different, in my opinion, and with this we move to the second part of the work carried out by Fondazione Prada's scientific committee. On the basis of the extraordinary scientific knowledge these days have been illustrated, can we really move with more trust to tackle the physical basis of diseases of the language, of the consciousness, of the thinking of the self? This will be the topic of the next international conference we want to organize.
Thank you very much, Massimo. I think that no better words could have been found. From the point of view of the neurologist, obviously, I have to underline some aspects that have really drawn my attention remarkably in this conference. It has really aroused, in a very strong manner, a multidisciplinary type of interest that we have tried to represent in the conference, and hopefully we've been able to convey to all of you following us. Now, the concepts that I believe it is appropriate to underline are that all that we have listened to has revealed the amazing evolution of knowledge in these past few years. So what we need to do is we need to really confront ourselves. We really need to tackle and face what our experiments are telling us. An enormous evolution that has also depended on the availability of new technologies. Let's just think about technologies such as the functional MRI that allow us to see a brain in action. We've seen from Giulio some amazing images of perturbations of the brain activity. We have seen how these induce changes in the state. We have also seen examples, very important examples that have been shown by by Professor Changeux. So I think this really is an irrenounceable element, and it stems from our curiosity. This is what really makes a scientist be a person who wants to know, who's curious, who wants to put the thirst for knowledge before his own personal convictions. And this is not an easy process, but we've seen it repeated a number of times over these days. Another message that I think I have been able to draw from all of these discussions, and the theme of these discussions has been extremely appropriate, is that today we have the opportunity of sort of dismantling, let's say, a part of the complexity which seems to be indispensable so as to generate consciousness. Now, this is a way of approaching the problem which is a bit different from the global one that I heard about tonight too. But I think that one supports the other. Without the support of the one, the other would lose strength. So I think that in the end, another aspect has been mentioned, and also Professor Seger has certainly mentioned it, Idan Segev has mentioned this in his presentation, is that there is a certain uniqueness in what human brains would like to bring forward. Embracing with scientific rigor the complexity of problems such as the ones that have been debated tonight on consciousness, but even the future ones that we shall be discussing about a consciousness that vanishes because of diseases that undermine it, that undermine its capability, its potential. And I also think that the amazing ability that our brain has, not only of thinking, of planning, but also of having and giving place to artistic expressions in a very, very high way of communication, a very high form of communication. As Moro said, without the language, it wouldn't have been possible to transfer knowledge, and therefore it wouldn't have been possible to have a culture emerge, at least in its structured form. And so I think that Miuccia Prada, in promoting this initiative, and starting off from the art, from beauty, has wanted to really inject, let's say, an artistic approach so that you can put two sectors which are normally considered as antithetical, which are not antithetical because they are both the supreme expression of our mental activities, to bring them together. So I would like to thank in particular Miuccia Prada, who is the president of the Fondazione Prada, for having launched this important challenge, for having started this challenge. I'd like to thank all of the components of the scientific committee, starting off from obviously Professor Cacciari, who has been one of the first to really launch this challenge and this initiative. And then you have seen over these evenings, we've had Vivian Kasam, we've seen in these evenings Jubin Abutalebi, we've had the opportunity of getting to know Andrea Moro, Daniela Perani, and then very important also, as though we had signed this pact, this agreement between the sciences and art, we had the presence of Udo Kittelmann, curator, a great curator and a great expert of how to translate in the reality of an exhibition, the complexity of human thought in its various articulation, in its various facets, and this has been really fundamental. Special thanks go to all of our discussants, all of the speakers, starting from the two present here. I'd like to thank very much Francesco and Giulio, who are here with us tonight. I think it's been a very important experience that we've had, and our starting point is not our point of arrival. It's not where we want to get there. As Professor Cacciari just said, we are looking ahead. We're looking at the possibility of having activities in the framework of diseases that may disturb the harmony of our brains. Our intention is to organize a series of other activities, workshops, small meetings. For the moment, they will have to be virtual, but only for the moment, hopefully. And then we will have the exhibition at the Exhibition of Art of Venice, which in 2022 will be representing for us a very important moment. And this is yet another challenge, because it's in an exhibition which is not in a usual context for the brain. I think that it's very, very important for this community that we have started to build, that we are building a community of experts, but at the same time of people who are all extremely interested in all of these topics. I think this should be supported. We have a platform that you can obviously use. Please register, because this gives you the possibility of being informed also about future activities and also putting forward your questions or your curiosities. And the recordings of these 5 wonderful evenings will be available soon, starting from the 18th of November on the platform of the Fondazione, and you have here the details if you want this. So I really think that it's a bit late, but it was really worth it. So thank you so much for everybody. Thanks, everybody, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.